The air and sea search was scaled down, with few signs of debris and fewer traces of life. Hopes of finding anyone alive were officially described as slim. Poor visibility didn't help, but a boy floating on driftwood was found by fishermen, the 27th survivor. At the ferry operator's headquarters in Manila, the anguish of relatives frantic for news was heightened by the admission that the ferry built to carry 600 sailed with 1,500 aboard.
Beneath the surface of the Tablas Strait, a haunting secret lies buried. The wreckage of the MV Doña Paz, a passenger ferry that vanished into the darkness, taking over 4,000 lives with it. On that fateful night in 1987, a collision with an oil tanker turned a routine journey into a fiery nightmare. No distress signals, no warnings, just a silent, tragic end.
As the official inquiry prepared to begin its work, the Coast Guard said nearly 160 burned and bloated bodies had been washed ashore or recovered from the sea during the search operation. Some were brought to this quayside in Manila. Angry relatives had been maintaining a vigil at the offices of the Sulpicio Lines, the owners of the ferry which had collided with the tanker and which was alleged to have been seriously overcrowded.
On December 20th, 1987, a disaster occurred on the waters of the Philippines that would go down in history as one of the deadliest maritime accidents ever. The MV Doña Paz, a passenger ferry, collided with the MT Vector, an oil tanker, in the Tablas Strait near Marinduque. This tragedy would claim the lives of approximately 4,386 people, making it the deadliest shipwreck in peacetime history, surpassing even the infamous Titanic disaster in terms of fatalities.
A Marine Board of Inquiry will begin work next Monday. It will review regulations which make it unnecessary for ships docking in Manila to register the number of passengers they carry. But the incomplete passenger lists mean the exact number of casualties in one of the worst maritime disasters in history may never be known.
The MV Doña Paz, a vessel operated by the Sulpicio Lines, was on its regular route, transporting over 4,000 passengers and crew members from Manila to Tacloban. On the night of the collision, the ship was packed with people returning home for the Christmas holidays. However, the MT Vector, which was carrying a load of oil, was operating under dubious circumstances. The tanker, owned by the Philippine-owned company, was unregistered, had no lookout, and was navigating with an unqualified master. This set the stage for a tragic encounter that would forever alter the lives of thousands. The collision itself was a catastrophic event. The MT Vector, which was sailing without any lights or warnings, slammed into the Doña Paz's starboard side at high speed. As a result, the oil tanker ruptured, spilling hundreds of tons of petroleum into the water. The explosion that followed engulfed both ships in flames. The MV Doña Paz, which was already heavily overloaded, was quickly consumed by fire. The combination of the initial impact, the explosion, and the rapid spreading of flames led to a massive loss of life. Only 26 people survived the wreck, with all others perishing either in the fire or by drowning. What followed the collision was a slow, painful response from both maritime authorities and rescue teams. Despite the sheer scale of the disaster, it reportedly took 8 hours for authorities to even become aware of the incident. Another 8 hours would pass before the full scale of the search and rescue operation began. By that time, the sea had claimed most of the passengers, and the chances of finding survivors were minimal. This delay in response was one of the critical failures in the aftermath of the collision, adding to the suffering of the families of the victims who were left in uncertainty for days. In the days following the incident, the Philippines Coast Guard began an investigation into the cause of the accident. However, the investigation was mired in controversy. The official report stated that the cause of the collision was due to the poor handling of the MV Doña Paz by its officers and crew. However, the families of the victims and others in the maritime community felt that the real blame lay with the MT Vector, whose operation without the necessary legal certifications and oversight was a key factor in the disaster. As it turned out, the tanker had been sailing without a valid permit and lacked adequate safety measures. The wreck of the MV Doña Paz remains one of the most haunting reminders of the dangers of poorly regulated maritime operations and the devastating impact of human error. It was not just the immediate loss of life that shocked the world, but also the fact that such a tragedy could happen in an era of advanced safety measures and regulation in the maritime industry. As the investigation into the collision continued, it became clear that the lessons learned from the disaster would have a far-reaching effect on the maritime community, leading to calls for stricter safety standards and better oversight. In the years following the disaster, the legacy of the MV Doña Paz continued to haunt the families of the victims. Many still question whether the tragedy could have been prevented with better communication, stricter regulations, and more timely responses from authorities. The absence of sufficient safety protocols on board the vessel, combined with the failure to properly manage the ship's overcrowding, meant that the death toll was far higher than it might have been otherwise. This lack of preparedness and the unreported deficiencies in the ship's operation meant that many passengers were left with no chance of survival once disaster struck. The collision between the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector exposed glaring weaknesses in both maritime regulations and ship safety standards, which had been overlooked or ignored for far too long. Despite its tragic nature, the event became a catalyst for change in the Philippine maritime industry, as well as a warning to others in the industry worldwide. The need for better safety training for crew members, more stringent regulations on ship safety, and more effective communication systems between vessels became more urgent in the years that followed. One of the most haunting aspects of the incident is the fact that the collision and the explosion occurred without any form of distress signal or communication. The MV Doña Paz crew did not have the opportunity to send out a mayday or give any warning to other ships in the vicinity. This lack of communication made the disaster even more devastating, as there was no chance for the surrounding ships to come to their aid in time. The maritime community had to come to terms with the reality that a major disaster could occur without any prior warning, and that the usual protocols for managing such situations were simply not enough in this case. The investigation into the wreckage would eventually reveal that the MT Vector was grossly unfit for the conditions in which it was operating. Inadequate training, poor maintenance, and a failure to meet basic safety standards contributed directly to the magnitude of the disaster. But the real shock came when it became evident that the MV Doña Paz had been operating far above its designed capacity. The ferry was overloaded, and the risk of disaster was heightened because of it. This fact, combined with the hazardous conditions of the stormy night, contributed to the rapid escalation of the situation once the collision occurred. Though many years have passed since the disaster, the memory of the MV Doña Paz continues to serve as a stark reminder of how vital it is to ensure that maritime vessels operate according to strict safety standards. This tragedy is a sobering example of how seemingly minor oversights, such as poor vessel management or failure to meet required safety standards, can have devastating consequences when combined with the wrong circumstances. As we move forward, the lessons learned from this disaster must continue to shape the way maritime safety is approached, ensuring that such a tragedy is never repeated. The wreck of the MV Doña Paz remains at the bottom of the sea, a silent testament to the dangers of overcrowding, poorly regulated maritime operations, and the ever-present threats of natural forces. The wreckage was only discovered in 2019, some 32 years after the incident, when advanced underwater drones were sent to survey the area. This discovery raised further questions about the disaster and shed light on the scale of the tragedy that had been hidden for so long. The footage from the underwater drones revealed just how deep the wreckage had sunk into the sea, and how much of the disaster's legacy remained buried in the depths of the ocean. In the years since, the legacy of the Doña Paz has sparked conversations about improving safety measures and regulatory oversight in the maritime industry. The disaster remains a topic of deep reflection, especially for the families of those who lost their lives on that fateful night. Though the full truth may never be known, the lessons that can be drawn from the tragedy of the MV Doña Paz are undeniable. Safety, preparedness, and oversight are crucial in preventing disasters of this magnitude from ever occurring again. The days following the disaster of the MV Doña Paz were marked by confusion, frustration, and uncertainty. As the wreckage of the ferry sank to the bottom of the sea, it seemed as if the answers to the tragic collision would be buried along with the victims. The Philippine maritime authorities faced a tremendous challenge in piecing together what had happened, but their efforts were hampered by a lack of immediate action and poor communication, which contributed to the delayed and ineffective search and rescue operation. The official investigation began shortly after the news of the collision spread, but the authorities found themselves at a significant disadvantage. Despite the enormity of the disaster, it reportedly took the Philippine Coast Guard 8 hours to learn of the collision. This delayed response to the distressing news left families with no information and no hope. Another 8 hours passed before the search and rescue operations could even begin, and by the time they did, the sea had claimed most of the victims. The authorities were left scrambling to recover bodies and any potential survivors from the wreckage. While the search and rescue teams fought against the harsh conditions of the sea, they were also faced with the logistical nightmare of trying to locate the wreck. With the wrecked ferry and oil tanker sinking into the depths of the Tablas Strait, there were few visible signs of the tragedy. The survivors, who had managed to escape the flames or swim to safety, were left to recount their harrowing experiences, while the families of the victims anxiously waited for news. The absence of distress signals and the fact that there had been no communication from the ferry left the families of the victims in limbo, wondering how such a disaster could occur without any warning or plea for help. The failure of the maritime authorities to respond promptly and efficiently to the disaster was a point of contention among many people. The Philippines, a nation deeply reliant on maritime transport, had long struggled with inadequate safety measures and regulations in the industry. The MV Doña Paz incident exposed the glaring weaknesses in the maritime system and underscored the need for systemic change. The delayed response, coupled with the lack of proper communication, left families feeling betrayed and frustrated, while the survivors were forced to endure the trauma of a tragedy that could have been prevented with better oversight and regulation. When the investigation finally began, it was clear that the MV Doña Paz's crew were not entirely at fault. The inquiry revealed that the tanker MT Vector, the vessel responsible for the collision, was itself unfit for operation. The tanker was operating without a valid license, and it had no lookout on board to ensure the safety of the ship. Furthermore, the tanker's master was not a qualified captain, further compounding the problems. These deficiencies in the Vector's operations were crucial factors in the collision, but the focus of the investigation appeared to shift away from the tanker's clear neglect of safety procedures and onto the actions of the ferry's crew. The Marine Board of Inquiry, tasked with investigating the cause of the disaster, ultimately concluded that the collision was due to the poor handling of the MV Doña Paz. However, many people, particularly the families of the victims, believed that the responsibility for the disaster should lie squarely with the MT Vector and its owner, who had failed to maintain the ship properly and violated various maritime regulations. The ferry's officers, despite operating in treacherous conditions, were still held accountable, while the tanker's severe negligence was treated as a secondary issue. This left many to question whether justice was truly served and whether the right parties were being held accountable for the events that led to the deaths of thousands of people. The aftermath of the disaster saw both families and maritime experts calling for greater accountability in the maritime industry. The incident had exposed the fatal flaws in the system, from the lax enforcement of safety regulations to the absence of proper vessel inspections. The poor state of the MT Vector and the failure to ensure that the MV Doña Paz was not overcrowded highlighted the vulnerabilities in the maritime industry that needed immediate attention. Over the following weeks and months, the public outrage grew as the families of the victims fought for justice. The Philippine government, under intense pressure, was forced to take action. In 1999, the Supreme Court of the Philippines ruled that the owners of the MT Vector were liable for the collision, ordering them to pay compensation to the families of the victims. However, this decision did little to ease the grief and frustration of the families, many of whom felt that the true scale of the tanker's negligence was not fully acknowledged. As the years passed, the MV Doña Paz disaster remained in the public consciousness, with various media outlets and documentaries recounting the tragedy. The case became a symbol of the dangers of overcrowded ferries and poorly maintained ships operating without proper safety oversight. For those who had lost loved ones, the sense of injustice lingered, as they could not reconcile the fact that the disaster had occurred due to a combination of human error, neglect, and regulatory failure. In the meantime, efforts to improve maritime safety in the Philippines gained momentum. The maritime industry, already under scrutiny for the MV Doña Paz disaster, began to implement changes in safety protocols. The government introduced more stringent regulations on ship safety, crew qualifications, and vessel inspections. These changes, while necessary, came too late for the victims of the tragedy. However, they represented a glimmer of hope that future maritime disasters might be prevented through stronger oversight and better safety practices. Despite the passing of time, the legacy of the MV Doña Paz disaster continued to shape the maritime landscape. The lessons learned from the tragedy became a foundation for improvements in safety practices and regulations. The event had highlighted the need for comprehensive reforms in the Philippines' maritime industry and had prompted calls for increased government involvement in monitoring and regulating the sector. It was a long overdue reminder that the lives of thousands of people should never be put at risk due to negligence and outdated safety practices. As part of the ongoing memorialization of the disaster, the wreckage of the MV Doña Paz was eventually located by underwater drones in 2019, more than 3 decades after the collision. This discovery marked a significant moment in the investigation into the disaster, as the wreckage of both the ferry and the oil tanker had remained submerged, shrouded in mystery for many years. The technology used in this investigation allowed experts to explore the wrecks in great detail, providing them with new insights into the events that led to the sinking of the MV Doña Paz. The underwater footage captured by the drones revealed the true extent of the damage to both vessels, further underscoring the catastrophic nature of the disaster. While the discovery brought some closure to the families of the victims, it also served as a stark reminder of the lives lost and the failures that led to the tragedy. The wreckage, now resting on the floor of the Tablas Strait, remains a haunting testament to the dangers of inadequate safety measures and poor oversight in the maritime industry. The legacy of the MV Doña Paz disaster continues to reverberate throughout the maritime world, with experts, historians, and maritime organizations using the event as a case study for improving safety standards. The disaster not only served as a wake-up call for the Philippines, but also for the wider maritime industry. It highlighted the need for rigorous enforcement of regulations, better training for crew members, and stricter oversight of vessels to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. Ultimately, the MV Doña Paz disaster was a preventable tragedy, one that was the result of a combination of negligence, overcrowding, and inadequate safety practices. The lessons learned from the disaster have since informed changes in maritime law and safety protocols, but the question remains, how many other tragedies, like the MV Doña Paz, could have been avoided if those responsible for the safety of passengers had done more to protect them? The answer lies in ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated, and that the lives lost on that fateful night are never forgotten. In the years following the devastating disaster of the MV Doña Paz, a mixture of grief, frustration, and speculation lingered as families and the public tried to make sense of the tragedy. Although the official investigation had been launched and the initial findings were published, the true cause of the collision and the subsequent loss of life was still clouded in mystery. The situation was further complicated by conflicting theories, technological limitations, and the absence of key evidence, such as black box data or eyewitness accounts. This left the maritime community, along with the families of the victims, struggling to understand how such a large-scale disaster could have occurred with so many unknowns. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, a number of theories began to circulate about what caused the collision between the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector. One of the leading theories suggested that the tanker had simply failed to properly navigate the waters, either because of inadequate training or because of the lack of proper safety equipment on board. The MT Vector was found to be operating under serious safety deficiencies, such as lacking a proper lookout and running without a valid license. These factors pointed to the tanker's negligence as the primary cause of the collision. However, the official investigation pointed the finger at the MV Doña Paz and its crew, blaming them for poor handling of the vessel during the storm. At the time, the official report from the Philippine Coast Guard focused on the MV Doña Paz's failure to respond appropriately to the stormy conditions. However, many within the maritime community questioned this conclusion, arguing that the ferry had been overloaded, which had likely contributed to the disaster. The overcrowding on the ferry was a key factor that had not been given enough attention in the investigation. The MV Doña Paz had been carrying far more passengers than it was legally allowed to, making it prone to instability in rough waters. This overcrowding, coupled with a lack of sufficient lifeboats, meant that even those who managed to survive the initial impact were left with little hope of escaping the ensuing fire and sinking. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the MT Vector's poor condition and its lack of safety measures, the official investigation's focus remained on the MV Doña Paz and its crew's actions. This approach led to widespread dissatisfaction among the families of the victims and the broader public. The families felt that the authorities had unfairly placed blame on the crew of the ferry, when in fact the true cause of the disaster lay with the reckless operation of the tanker. The findings of the inquiry, which seemed to ignore the glaring deficiencies of the MT Vector, left many feeling as though the real story of the disaster had been overlooked. As the years went by, the story of the MV Doña Paz continued to capture the attention of the media and maritime experts alike. The disaster became a symbol of the dangers posed by an under-regulated maritime industry, one where safety standards were often ignored in favor of profit. The focus on the MV Doña Paz's actions also prompted further investigations into the state of the country's maritime regulations. It became clear that the tragedy had exposed fundamental flaws in the way the Philippine government had been overseeing the safety of its vessels. Calls for reform grew louder, and the need for stronger regulations and more effective enforcement of maritime laws became a priority. In the 1990s, as the disaster began to fade from the headlines, new information emerged that shed additional light on the events of December 20, 1987. A number of maritime experts and historians began to re-examine the wreckage of the two ships, using more advanced technology that was not available during the initial investigation. The development of new sonar systems and submersible vehicles provided researchers with the opportunity to conduct deep water surveys of the wrecks of the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector. These new investigations revealed details that had been previously overlooked, suggesting that the true cause of the collision might not have been a simple matter of human error or poor judgment. In 2019, more than 30 years after the tragedy, the wrecks of the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector were finally located using state-of-the-art underwater drones. These drones, equipped with advanced sonar technology and 4K cameras, were able to capture high-resolution images of the wrecks lying deep beneath the surface of the Tablas Strait. This discovery allowed investigators to get a much clearer picture of the events that led to the disaster, offering new insights into the design flaws and structural weaknesses of the ships involved. The footage from the underwater drones revealed the true extent of the damage to both vessels. The MT Vector, which had been carrying oil at the time of the collision, had suffered significant structural damage, particularly in the area where the ferry had struck. The collision had ruptured the tanker's hull, causing an oil spill that led to the subsequent explosion. This new evidence reinforced the theory that the MT Vector's structural failure had played a crucial role in the disaster. The tanker's hull had been compromised by the collision, causing it to spill its cargo of petroleum into the water, which then ignited in a deadly fire. This explosion quickly consumed the MV Doña Paz, setting it ablaze and making it almost impossible for those on board to escape. However, the most significant finding from these new investigations was the discovery of the serious flaws in the design and maintenance of both vessels. The MV Doña Paz was found to have been significantly overcrowded, which made it especially vulnerable in stormy conditions. In addition, the vessel was lacking many of the basic safety features that are now considered standard for maritime vessels, such as sufficient lifeboats and life jackets for all passengers. The lack of these essential safety features had drastically reduced the chances of survival for those aboard the ferry. Furthermore, the MT Vector, with its dilapidated state and unlicensed operation, highlighted the failure of the maritime regulatory system to properly monitor and enforce safety standards. This new evidence prompted a reassessment of the earlier investigations and opened up a broader discussion about the state of maritime safety in the Philippines. The discovery of the wrecks and the new findings reinforced the need for stronger regulations, better oversight, and improved safety measures for both passenger ferries and cargo ships. It also brought the issue of overcrowding to the forefront, highlighting the need for stricter enforcement of capacity limits on vessels. Many experts believe that, had the MV Doña Paz been properly regulated, with sufficient safety equipment and capacity management, the disaster could have been avoided. Despite these new revelations, the full extent of the disaster's cause remains a subject of debate. Some critics of the official inquiry continue to argue that the investigation failed to hold the right parties accountable for their role in the tragedy. They point to the fact that, despite the overwhelming evidence of the MT Vector's negligence, the authorities continued to focus on the actions of the MV Doña Paz's crew. This focus on the ferry's crew, rather than the tanker's clear violations of safety protocols, has led many to believe that justice was not fully served in the aftermath of the disaster. In the years since the wreckage of the two ships was discovered, efforts have been made to address some of the issues raised by the MV Doña Paz disaster. The Philippine government has introduced stricter regulations on passenger ferries and cargo ships, including measures to reduce overcrowding, improve ship maintenance, and ensure that vessels meet the highest safety standards. These changes, while important, have come too late for the victims and their families, who continue to mourn the loss of their loved ones. However, the legacy of the MV Doña Paz has become a turning point for maritime safety in the Philippines, and the lessons learned from the tragedy continue to shape the way the country approaches maritime regulation today. The search for answers surrounding the MV Doña Paz disaster has been a long and difficult journey, with many questions still left unanswered. While the wreckage of the ships and the new investigations have provided valuable insights into the causes of the collision, the true extent of the failures that led to the tragedy remains a painful reminder of the need for constant vigilance and accountability in the maritime industry. The MV Doña Paz disaster remains a powerful and painful chapter in the history of maritime accidents. The tragic loss of over 4,000 lives on December 20, 1987, has haunted not only the families of the victims, but also the maritime industry, both in the Philippines and globally. Although significant time has passed, the questions raised by this catastrophe have not faded, and efforts to understand the full scale of what happened continue to this day. While the wreckage of the two ships involved, the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector, was discovered decades later, new findings have only deepened the sense of tragedy, while also offering important lessons for the future. In the wake of the disaster, the years of investigations and research had not been enough to fully satisfy the thirst for answers. The initial focus of the inquiries was primarily on the MV Doña Paz and its crew, with some arguing that the tragedy stemmed from human error or mismanagement. However, as time passed and new evidence came to light, the narrative began to shift. One of the most crucial revelations came in 2019, when advanced underwater drones located the wrecks of both the MV Doña Paz and the MT Vector, nearly 3 decades after the tragedy. The underwater footage allowed investigators to view the wrecks in unprecedented detail, shedding light on the nature of the disaster in a way that had never been possible before. The discovery of the wrecks offered an opportunity to revisit the events that led to the disaster. The footage revealed the extent of the damage suffered by both vessels. The MT Vector, which had been carrying a cargo of petroleum, had ruptured upon impact, spilling oil into the sea. This caused an explosive fire that quickly engulfed the MV Doña Paz, turning it into a blazing inferno. The overwhelming intensity of the flames made survival for the passengers on the ferry nearly impossible. The conditions aboard the ferry were exacerbated by the vessel being severely overcrowded, which left very little room for escape or for the deployment of safety equipment, such as lifeboats or life vests. But while the new discoveries helped to piece together the chain of events, they also raised important questions about the responsibility of both ships in the incident. The MT Vector was found to have been operating under conditions that violated basic safety regulations. It had no lookout, no proper navigation system, and no valid license to operate. This glaring lack of safety precautions on the tanker was a major factor in the collision. However, the official investigation, which had focused on the MV Doña Paz, did not place enough emphasis on the failure of the MT Vector to comply with maritime safety standards. This discrepancy in the investigation's findings led to a sense of injustice among the families of the victims, many of whom felt that the true cause of the disaster had not been fully acknowledged. Despite the delays and the controversy surrounding the investigations, the aftermath of the MV Doña Paz tragedy led to significant changes in the Philippine maritime industry. In the years following the disaster, there was growing recognition of the need to improve safety standards and regulations in order to prevent such a catastrophic event from happening again. The tragedy exposed the systemic flaws in the industry, from poorly maintained vessels to inadequate safety measures for passengers. These issues were not isolated to the MV Doña Paz, but were part of a broader pattern of negligence within the sector. The findings from the underwater drones have reignited the debate about what could have been done to prevent the disaster. The lessons learned from the tragedy have led to some improvements in the maritime sector, including stricter regulations on overcrowding, improved vessel inspections, and better safety equipment for passengers. While these measures were essential steps toward improving the safety of maritime travel, the question remains, could more have been done in the past to prevent such a disaster from occurring in the first place? The families of the victims have found some degree of closure in the knowledge that the wrecks were finally located, and that the truth about what happened has been brought to light. However, the pain of losing so many loved ones in such a horrific manner can never be fully healed. The MV Doña Paz disaster continues to serve as a tragic reminder of the importance of vigilance in ensuring that safety standards are upheld, and that human lives are never again put at such unnecessary risk. The wreck of the MV Doña Paz, resting at the bottom of the Tablas Strait, stands not only as a memorial to those who perished but also as a call to action for the maritime industry, to never forget the lessons learned from this disaster. In the years since the wreck was discovered, the event has also taken on a symbolic meaning for maritime safety, serving as a catalyst for further reforms in the industry. Advocates for stronger regulations and better safety practices continue to reference the disaster as a key moment in the push for change. The MV Doña Paz remains a poignant example of how systemic failures can lead to catastrophic loss, but also how such tragedies can, in the end, drive improvements that save lives. As time passes, the legacy of the MV Doña Paz continues to shape the way the maritime world approaches safety. New generations of sailors, regulators, and passengers now have a deeper understanding of the importance of rigorous safety standards and the consequences of failing to uphold them. The disaster left behind a profound sense of loss and unanswered questions, but it also inspired lasting changes that have made maritime travel safer. While the wreck of the MV Doña Paz will always serve as a tragic reminder of what happened, it has also become a symbol of progress, change, and the relentless pursuit of a safer future for all who take to the seas.